Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Daniel-Stillman, and he's here to share with us his new book, Good Talk: How to Design Conversations That Matter. Now, Daniel designs conversations for a living and insists you should too. He works with organizations like Google, Nike, and Visa to help them frame and sustain productive dialogue, deepen their facilitation skills, and coach them through the innovation process. Daniel also hosts the Conversation Factory podcast, where he interviews leaders, changemakers, and innovators on how they design conversations in their work and lives. So let's welcome to the show, Daniel-Stillman.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here. This is my favorite topic to talk about, so, you know.
Well, I'm glad, because we're going to be talking about talking. Who knew it could be this big a deal? But it is, because everything's so based on communication. Yeah. And a lot of times, I think people don't even understand, and this is why I love your book so much, a lot of times people don't even understand how wrong they're getting it.
Yeah, it's funny. My friend Abby Covert, who wrote a wonderful book called How to Make Sense of Any Mess, who, you know, I really admired her work, and she inspired me to write my book 100%. Her blurb for the book really touched me, because she had this perspective that she said, if you're laboring under the assumption that talking and communication is something that we all humans just do naturally, right? Like, then you should read this book. And we can remember when we learned how to play checkers or chess, but we don't remember learning how to talk. We don't remember learning how to argue or to negotiate or to sell or to convince or to tell a joke. These are all things that are absolutely critical to daily, I hate to use the word survival, but it's how we live. It's how we breathe in the world, is through communicating with other people. And we're kind of just winging it mostly. Scrapped together little pieces and tidbits from various people, but I don't think anybody's really thought to themselves, like, what am I doing here? You know, what's my approach? What's my philosophy of this thing?
Yeah, without a doubt. I can think back in my career, working in the corporate world, and even just kind of first starting out. You'd meet these people who are really good-hearted people, but at the same time, they would throw like conversational grenades, and you're just like, wow, okay, how do I even deal with this? Because it's all based on, a person's perception, how they've been brought up, and you really kind of bring it down to science in many ways.
Well, the science part is really, I have a degree in physics, which I don't know if it just makes me curious about breaking things down. And there are some really basic fundamentals of just understanding what's happening with the physics of the thing. It's kind of crazy just to realize that, generally speaking, we leave a 200 millisecond gap between when one person speaks and when we feel like we better start saying something, and this is across many, many cultures, this sense that long pauses are uncomfortable and rude. And so we start speaking, but it actually takes like 600 milliseconds to form a thought. And so basically that means that if somebody stops talking and we start talking, there's at least 400 milliseconds where we're just winging it. And that's why people and ah, but that's also why we put our foot in our mouth. I don't know what we could do. It would be delightful if we could make it okay to say, hey, can I just think for a minute? I'd love to give you a well thought out response. But that sometimes makes us look calculated or political or not spontaneous. So it's like, if we don't have something right off the cuff, then we're not being authentic. But we all need time to think before we talk. Ideally, I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Nope. I would actually use the excuse that I need a cup of coffee before I could answer. I would buy any time I could get,
Yeah, so. And that's a great fix. Good job for developing a hack for yourself. And I think we all need that, those tips and tricks to look, I don't know if I believe in introversion versus extroversion. Like there's no I'm one way versus another. Like we're different with our friends and family than we are with strangers. When we're comfortable, when we're at ease, everyone is more voluble. But the truth is that some people process externally and some people prefer to process internally. And so I always like to tell the joke that good process, like when I'm doing business facilitation, which is a lot of what I do professionally, I think good process protects the introverts from the extroverts by giving everyone time to think. But, the secret reward at the other side is that we also protect the extroverts from themselves. Those of us who process out loud don't realize we're affecting how everyone else is thinking. And if we want to have really good conversations, this is just me personally, I think it's nice to respect and consider everyone's opinion if they're at the table or if they're in the room. Like if they're there, I think they're worth being heard. And if somebody just, hey, just off the top of my dome, I'm thinking this to this big question that we have, it's going to just affect what everyone else is going to think because of the anchoring bias. Again, this is going back to the science stuff of people have a bias. Once they hear one thing, they're either responding to it for or against. Whereas there's another option, which is just letting everyone think what they're thinking before we start talking.
When we choose that third option, let everyone think before we start thinking, how does that put us in a place where we're able to really have constructive, a conversation with people based off of what we're hearing as opposed to, going off of our biases?
Yeah, it's at least having it's sort of ironic. It's having the conversation about the conversation. If you Google meetings about meetings, there's a lot of articles about the types of meetings there are. And I remember one I was reading where they were like, hey, well, the one type of meeting you shouldn't have is the meetings about meetings. And I'm like, that's the one meeting everybody should have it, right? We should totally be talking about how we talk. Why should we make a decision based on who speaks the loudest or who's most cleverest in the moment, right? At least getting everyone to say well, how are we deciding things generally? Are those decisions working for us? Who actually gets to decide? Is this about opinion or is this about facts? I think it's okay to press the pause button and roll things back and say, how are we approaching our communication? I think it's time worth spent. I'm not saying to have that conversation every day, but having it once a month or once a quarter is worth having that dialogue. If it feels safe to have it in your office, it would be hard to do that with your friends and family. But it's, in the book, we use examples from people's personal lives too, because these issues of communication come up in our personal lives much more so, and they're much harder to talk about because the stakes seem higher. Because if these relationships are what keep us alive. If we lose them or jeopardize them, nobody really wants to do that. It's scary to do those things.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to be the bull in the china shop with conversation,
Right. It's like, oh, Daniel just always wants to talk about how we're talking this again. But it's like, I don't say you bring it up often. But yeah, it's hard to find an invitation that makes people willing to and open to the conversation, which is why you just make it simple. I remember the first time somebody did this to me. We were starting at the beginning of a project, and she said, hey, what are your working styles? How do you like to work? And I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, oh, well, are you a calendar person? Are you you're a list person? Are you an Excel person? Or are you a Word doc person? Where do you like to keep your work conversations? And I was like, whoa, this is so great. There's so many strange conflicts that teams have about this. I've had this happen in my companies where we're trying to use Slack, but somebody's still on Asana, and we're trying to go to we just have to have the conversations in the same place. It's like literally we can't talk if we're not in the same place, digitally or physically.
So what are some of the ways, and this is probably a good point to ask this question, what are some of the ways that we can determine what our conversation operating system is? Because I think a lot of people may get a little confused. They may be, running on the original, Macintosh,
Yeah, I know. It's so funny. I've thought about a quiz and I don't know. I'm against typing people, which is kind of ironic because I did say here's your operating system. I think it's good to just reflect. There are reflection questions throughout the book that people can ask themselves, but people can just ask themselves, like, Mr. Hot versus Mr. Cool. That was one of the examples that I think is funny. We all know people who do not or will not or cannot see people wronging them. And there's people who are on the opposite side where everything just turns on the emergency red light button, where you cross them a little bit and it's like, they're coming loaded for bear. Like, it's on. It's about introspection. There's really no substitute for introspecting and saying, well, what's working in my conversational style? What's not working? If you can be specific about what's not working, you can start to find ways to shift it. Error management, like, do you see errors everywhere? Is the whole world against you? Versus like, you're not spotting at all and there are no boundaries for you. That's an easy one. But if you're not getting what you want in life, you may not be asking for what you need, which means you may not be framing things as invitations. So those are two small components. I think it would be hard to diagnose somebody. I would hesitate to do that to or for somebody. I'm not a clinical psychologist, and the elements of the operating system that I put together are observational. They're not clinical. So I would never type somebody based on them. But they're questions for people to reflect on. They're questions for people to look at their own conversations and say, like, yeah, is it time for a reboot or an upgrade? But the problem is, Marianne, and this is straight up, a lot of the people who need this help are not going to read this book and are unaware. Like, it's only by luck or grace or chance that somebody begins to realize that active listening is a good idea. Right? I was coaching a guy who came to my work through a professional program I was doing, and he showed up to a coaching call, and he was like, well, I don't really have any business stuff to work on right now because I'm off the bench, which happens in certain large consultancies. I was like, well, what's going on? And he's like, well, this, and this. And we wound up using a tool called the importance difficulty matrix, which is a pretty standard in the facilitative consulting world. We wound up using this 2x2 matrix of impact and difficulty for him to facilitate a conversation with his wife about their collective to-do list. And he came back the next week and he was like, oh my God, I think my wife loves me more now because she's being heard actively and I'm acting on what she wants and needs. I mean, it seems so, it's like, he's like, this is amazing. What else can I do with this? Like, I was like, yeah, man, just keep going. Just keep listening to your wife. And, there you go. Good job, buddy. And I don't think his marriage was bad. I just think he was under these kind of habitual masculine patterns of like, we just kind of getting along and, the old lady wants me to do some stuff, so I'll do it. Like, it's this very, the woman's doing all this emotional labor to like hold stuff together and she's telling him stuff to do. Like, that's a really old, you want to talk about an old operating system. That is a tired operating pattern. And he started
way tired.
It's way tired. You want to do wired and tired. Like, that is way tired. And he started to learn how to dismantle it through active, facilitative dialogue. And this is what I mean when I say you got to redesign your conversations. He came in with a really good design for a conversation, and he left with a collaborative clarity about what needed to get done in the family life. Booyah. I'm so happy for him.
That is so great to hear that. And you know what? It's amazing how many Christmases and holidays come up that this will show up on somebody's desk or somebody's chair or wherever their little space is, that they'll pick it up and start reading going, hey, do you know what? I maybe need to look at some things and make some changes. And you know what a great place it would be if we had people that were coming from a place where they're doing, involved in conversation in just a deeper way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I would love for people to step back and say, what does the conversation need that I'm in? And what do the conversations in my life need? And then to even step one step further back and say, what conversations are missing in my life? Right? Like, where's my conversation with myself? Where's my conversation with the larger community or the culture or humanity? Right? These
Well,
are
I think
the conversations. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, I think people are ready for that right now. I think people
Yes.
are really craving to have deeper connections, especially because, you're right. I mean, because we're living in a very interesting time. We're
Right.
we're
The old curse.
the
May
old
you live in
curse.
interesting times.
Yes. But at the same time, it's a great opportunity for growth and expansion if we choose to take it.
Yes. Very, very much so. Introspection is never wasted time, but it can feel that way. We live, at least in our American culture, fast is the preferred pace, right? Getting her done, like getting things built and moving on. I work with companies where they're living in a 30-minute meeting culture. It is really hard, and if those meetings run over, like what are we doing? Like, are we supposed to really be accomplishing stuff and getting real connection and real agreement and real alignment in those kind of rapid fire meetings? It is a lot to ask. And you and I are one-on-one. We can manage that. We can have a pretty deep connected conversation in a short period of time. But if you've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people, the conversations get real messy. And some people prepared and some people didn't, and some people show up late. Some people need to leave early. That is chaos. Like, how are we? It is shocking to imagine how anything does get done. I am amazed that somehow my clients still make money when this is their meeting culture, and I'm supposed to help them. Like, you guys are. I mean, you're surviving. Good job. Good. It's amazing, and it's hard to change it. It's really hard to change it because we have this feeling, and I don't know if you feel this way, but we need to be available to people all the time. When somebody sends you an email or a text and there's like, hey, can you send me this? Or I was looking for that. Or when you talk this, can we pick your brain? It is really hard with this influx of requests at all times to parse them out and to decide which invitations to respond to and how to say no in an invitational way. It is so challenging to balance all of those conversations. There's literally like dozens and dozens of conversational threads that we're all trying to like weave together nonstop. It's a lot.
I think it's a lot for people to manage just on a daily basis. And,
Yes.
then you've got me bumbling it up with you here about your book.
Yeah. And yeah, people are like, oh, did you listen to my podcast? I'm like, oh my God, it's on my phone. I really haven't had a chance to it. It's a lot. It's a lot for people. It's a lot of noise.
Yeah, they're being hit with so much, but I think this is why it's such a great time for your book, Good Talk, because I mean, people are looking for just deeper connection, like I said earlier. And what are some ways that they can design conversations so that they get that meaningful connection that they're desiring?
Yes. Well, so the components of the conversation operating system, there are 9 there in the book. Some of the ones that I think are easiest to start looking at. So this is like, we need to like break down what it means to design a conversation, Marianne. Like, I come from. Have you ever watched the movie Ghost?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, it's an amazing movie. Bears rewatching. There's that classic scene with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore, making the clay sculpture. When you're spinning a potter's wheel, there's clay, and you've got your hands, and you're shaping clay, and you sort of like mush your hand in the middle, and you pull outwards, and it's clay. But if you want to make a pot out of some other material that looks like a clay pot, you have to use completely different processes to do it. I studied industrial design, so this is like how I think about things. If you want to make a wood bowl or a glass bowl or a steel bowl, it's still a bowl, and we're still designing it. We're still trying to make a bowl, but we have to use different processes for different materials. And I think I just want people to start breaking down conversations into its little sub parts And one really, really critical part of conversations is, we've talked a little bit about it before, is turn taking. It seems almost absurd to just highlight that I speak and then you speak and then I speak and then you speak. And then when you speak, I have an option. I can ask you more about what you just said, or I can respond with something of my own. Right? Pretty basic fact of speaking.
Yes.
And but we all know people who make all the conversations about themselves. It's like, hey, what's going on with you, Marianne? You're like, oh, well, blah, 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 I'm doing this. I'm like, yeah, okay, so I'm doing this. And now, like, we both said what we're doing, right? But if you say, hey, so this is what's going on for me, and I say, oh, well, tell me more about this or that, I can follow the facts. Like, I can ask more about the facts, or I can say, oh, that sounds hard, or that sounds fun. I can ask about the feelings. And so it's really just being thoughtful about what we do with our turn. Are we reacting? Are we inquiring? Are we reflecting? These are choices we have. I don't think many of us are aware of the choices we have, because that little moment, that 200 millisecond clock is ticking all the time, and we don't want to seem rude. And so we say something, and we say it from our habitual place. And so the flip side is cadence, just working on slowing down. And that means slowing down all the time, like slowing down in the shower. It's slowing down when you're writing an email. I don't know about you, but like when my computer thinks for like a millisecond, I get pretty close to an uncontrollable rage. Like I see it happening. I managed not to like actually throw my computer across the room, but it's amazing how impatient we can be. And so turn taking is one thing to be aware of, and cadence is another. Just the willingness and the ability to slow down a little bit so that something different than normal can happen. If people can get those two, that'd be pretty amazing.
Oh my God, that'd be awesome. Could you imagine what the world would be like if people actually slowed down? And I mean, because I believe we're probably from the same era. I mean, I remember life before iPhones, and it was great.
Yeah. But I remember like having to write down directions on little pieces of paper. That was not awesome.
Yeah, not so great on that one. No.
But yeah, so the willingness to just pause and have more pauses, non-trivial, hard to do, really, really impactful. So those are two things I think people can do, is being thoughtful about their turns and then having more space between the turns. And then the third element, which I think is always, actually there's one we're not talking about, and I feel like it's worth talking about now and today, is conversations are made out of people. This seems even stupider to talk about, but the people in the conversation entirely determine the quality of the dialogue. And we know this because we try to like kick people out of our Facebook feeds, for example, if we don't like them, don't like what they're saying. You know, your old roommate who has rants about politics that you don't enjoy anymore, or your uncle who's terrible about one thing or another. When we start filtering out who we are willing to listen to, it weakens our empathy muscles. And I'm concerned that they will atrophy completely. And it's worth looking at. I was talking to a friend of mine recently. There's a tool that he was using to basically unfollow everyone on Twitter. Like, you go back to the beginning and unfollow people. And then he's trying to intentionally follow people on Twitter who don't look like him. Right? So this is about diversity. If our conversations are diverse, we will expose ourselves to diverse perspectives. And I don't want to point diversity and just say it's about color, right? Now, in this moment we're in today, it's absolutely essential for everybody across the spectrum to be listening to more diverse voices across the spectrum of identity in race. But it's also about having friends and information coming at you from different ages. Right? I was talking to a friend of mine who said that 9 years on either side, it can be transformative. Having somebody who's 9 years older than you and 9 years younger than you, at least, can just open up the way you're thinking and what you're learning and what you're seeing. Right? So we need that diversity of origin and history and age so that our conversations can be rich and robust and not a little tiny bubble of just what we like to hear and just what we already know. That's a really important thing that everybody can be doing right now is actively seeking out diversity in the people that they interact with on a regular basis.
I love that. I think we all need to learn as we continue to grow. And that's such a perfect way of doing it. Because if we keep the same viewpoint,
yes,
and we're around people that believe the same thing we do, I mean, how boring is that?
Yes, and that's, yes, boring or comfortable, right? It's definitely comfortable. It's definitely comfortable. Look, I love the New Yorker magazine, and I love hanging out with, my lefty liberal New York friends. And it is not easy. And I'll just say, it's not easy for me to read Fox News or Breitbart. It's not easy, but it's something that we have to inoculate ourselves to. And I think people on the right and people on the left, boy, oh boy, hard to have that conversation, right? Because people on either side of the political spectrum are literally seeing different news. And so we're not having the same conversation because we're not even talking about the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting how much the viewpoint will be completely different on topics just because we haven't opened ourselves up to maybe the greater discussion, and another side is having. So, what a great point to make. And I think that's why Good Talk was such a useful book, because it helps us look beyond our sphere of what you call comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's important to do. It's not easy to do, but it's definitely essential. And I think it's sometimes hard to hear opinions we don't like. And I'll just speak for myself. I'll say I statements. I think there's a fear I have that somehow I'll be convinced, right? I'll forget what I know. However, there's another alternative, another option, which is deep listening and inquiry. It is actually the best way to deal with somebody you rabidly disagree with is to ask them lots of open-ended questions about their opinions, not in the hopes of destroying them or dismantling their perspective, but really learning what it is that they are loving. There's something good in their opinion. Nobody is actually, I was just reading about this recently. There's this classic Platonic perspective. Socrates and Plato basically had this opinion that nobody ever actually does anything that they think is evil or wrong. They're just acting with regards to a very small circle, right? When we steal from someone else, we are not thinking about the other person. We're thinking about ourselves, right?
That's true.
Right, yeah. So if you really stop and think, it's hard to do. But when we start to empathize with someone else, we're like, oh my God, that was a terrible thing to do to them. And I find that this is one of the challenges. I think often people start to realize, and you saw this with the debate about homosexuality in our culture over the last 30 years. I think once some people on the conservative side started to actually meet and know and learn and talk to people who had this lifestyle, who this was their lived experience, they started to go, oh, well, I mean, I guess my daughter's not an evil person and she totally should have the right to get married. So I guess that's okay. Right? And it just took longer because they just weren't around it. The people like me who grew up in New York City and who grew up around quote unquote people like that were like, yeah, it's just whatever. Like, this is life. They go do their thing and we go do our thing. Like, we don't need a law about that, do we? And then some people were like, no, we totally need a law about that. We need to protect marriage. And we're like, what does that mean? From who? For what? And that was a hard conversation that our culture had. It moved surprisingly quickly if you compare it to racial equality. That conversation, that big conversation, happened relatively rapidly. We're still having the conversation about racial equality, and it's been a really long time. Somehow we haven't gotten that conversation properly. And one of the reasons for that, I think, Marianne, is that sustained dialogue is hard because it is work. It is work to do this. My friend Nikki Silvestri, who I had on my podcast recently, I'm still working on her editing. She's a facilitator. She's a woman of color. And I really love reading her emails because it lights up my brain to hear her voice on this stuff. And she says, look, she said this recently in an email to her list. She was like, this is hard because protesting feels good and gets some of it's like people want to shout Black Lives Matter. That is a short-term, one-way conversation. It is a short one-way conversation. I'll say it again. It's like, we're going to go out and we're going to protest and we're going to be heard. It is much harder to write letters to your congressman like every week. It is much, much harder to run for Congress. It is so much harder to get a bill passed, right? That is work. It is work to negotiate and to have those dialogues. It is non-trivial, and I really respect the people who have the energy to do it. I recently realized I had to do more, and I made a scholarship for 5 people of color from the facilitation masterclass that I teach. And then I was like, oh my God, now I have to like read all these applications and pick people who like, it's work. It's work. My allyship takes effort, and I should not bemoan my fate. I'm grateful to do it. I'm really happy to create the opportunity to create more diversity in the group coaching and facilitation experiences that I offer, because it's important. I know everyone's going to benefit from it, but it is hard. And I think because of that, everyone needs to take time to sustain themselves and make sure they know why they're doing what they're doing. And that's the conversation with yourself, right? Which almost nobody, our Western culture, generally, introspection is not our forte, I would say. I don't know. You think differently, or would you agree that extroversion is kind of the flavor of us?
Well, I think most people doing that inward dive can be a little bit like a unicorn, but it's much needed.
Yeah,
we all need that.
Yes, we all need it, and it's not in our calendars, right? Like this is one of the great things about. I had this wonderful gentleman, Casper Tekul, on my show. He wrote a book called The Power of Ritual. It's a wonderful book. He has a tech Sabbath. Like he has an email where he says like, Friday night to Saturday night. And he's not Jewish. He's like, he's just inspired by the Sabbath because he studies religion as a way of trying to understand its wisdom in our lives today. Bringing that conversation forward into now. Like that's what's so great about church and Sabbath. It's like, at least it's Saturday and or Sunday that you're going to you're supposed to go hang out with people, cook, be with family, and reflect on what's important in your life. But when there's no secular substitute for that generally. And so I think people are really struggling to find ways to bring that inner spiritual conversation into their lives in a sustained way without religion. And it's non-trivial. It is not easy to do, to make that space and time for yourself.
Yeah, that is a real tough one, but it's important to have these times where you can just, focus on what really matters.
Yeah.
And, and how often do we do that? It needs to be a calendar item. It needs to be a calendar item,
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. And I think we're all guilty, myself included. Tonight I'm in a men's group, and my men's group meets every week, and it is kind of like my emotional workout for the week. I get together with a group of men and we talk about our feelings, and we practice empathizing and listening and connecting. It's work. I'm exhausted by it. Most of the time I don't want to go. Right? Like literally I'm like, do I really have to go do this thing again? And the answer is no, I don't. But I somehow choose to keep doing it because I know that it's like going to the gym or eating a salad. Like it just feels better after you do it. Uh, and I wish there was more places where people can do that to practice intentional communication like that. It's worth doing.
So now during this time, I mean, of course, we've talked about we're living in a time of very interesting history. You know, are are you finding that people are reaching out to you more to see about how dialogues can be started to make these massive changes?
Mm,
Because you really provide the groundwork for this to take place.
yeah. I'll be honest, Marianne. I think people globally are undergoing a massive psychological shock, and that's before the Black Lives Matter resurgence in the last week or so. I think most organizations in March, April, were just in a dazed and confused state. You just have a blunt trauma to your head and you're kind of stumbling around like, what is happening? A lot of my client work just dissolved because a lot of my work was in person and a lot of companies were only focusing on absolute complete survival, right? Triage. Like, how do we make it through? There was so much uncertainty. At the same time, because of that survival modality, I think I started offering my facilitation and coaching services around virtual collaboration, which is in the business world something that it is the most immediate hot need that people have right now. When I say hot, I mean like hot like cool. I mean like it's absolutely necessary. People inside of large, mid-size, and small organizations are like, we don't know how to have effective meetings online. We barely knew how to do it in person, and now that we're online, we're totally we're in a hole, let's just say. And so my facilitation masterclass has been doing very well. I used to run like 2 or 3 publicly a year, and I'm running the 5th one since March, starting tomorrow. So I've been doing a lot of those because people really do need them. But I think it's more individuals, 1 or 2 people from inside of an organization being like, I need this help. I think it's a really hard, and this is just my own perception. I know some consultants who are experiencing different landscapes, but I think by and large, companies are just starting to realize, whoa, this is going to really go on for a while. And so we really need to start getting used to this new place, this new experience, this new process, and these new skills. And so they're starting to engage me more in that next step for them as they're sort of recovering from that blunt trauma to the head and going like, okay, I'm reoriented now. What do we have to get done? How are we going to make it through 2020? Because it's not even, we're halfway through now. There's a lot more to come.
I think a lot of people are at this place, and you're right. They're just kind of stunned, going, "Okay, half the year's done. How do we manage the rest?" And yeah, online meetings. I mean, how difficult
Yeah.
has that become for companies that don't even communicate well? And
Yeah.
now they're getting to a place where they're like, "Hey, now I've got to communicate with my employees in a different way." You
Mm-hmm.
need new tools to be able to do that, and I think Good
Yes.
Talk's a good way to start.
So, it's funny that we say we need new tools, and I think there's a double-edged sword on that because of course we need new tools. I found that often people are freaked out by the technology and overwhelmed by it, and it's a shame because there's so many ways around it. There's also very old tools that can help us. Group process, like sitting in a circle and hearing from every person in turn. We were talking about turn taking. Turn taking is important when it's one on one and making a choice about what I'm going to do with each turn. Am I going to reply? Am I going to respond? Or am I going to inquire? Right? Those are like fundamental choices. Am I going to ask more? Or am I going to tell you something about what I think about that? And so if I have a group conversation, it is even more critical to clarify. We're just going to hear from everyone. Everyone's going to state their opinion. We're not going to state my opinion about your opinion, because then things are just going to go way off the rails. And so that kind of circling these intentional patterns for how we share things out, these are very old tools. This is like the Native Americans passing a peace pipe. This is Quakers having Quaker meeting, right? Like you speak when the spirit moves you, but only when the spirit moves you. Like you really try to make sure, like, is this coming from deep inspiration or am I just talking to fill the air? And so these are really old tools that we have to refine dialogue. And I would love for people to be a little bit more, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for here? I would love for them to be students of traditional dialogue patterns because there's lots to pull from. Like it would be really worthwhile for people to, especially for group conversations, bring in some oldies but goodies.
Well, and for a lot of people, especially different generations who grew up with iPhones and not really being able to converse, this could
Yes.
be a whole new skill set, you know?
Right. Yeah, and we can think of it as technology, right? It is a
Mhm.
technology to be able to design a dialogue and say, hey, okay, so here's what we're going to do. Everyone write down what they think, and then we'll all put it up on a shared digital white space, and then we'll just move them together quietly, and then we'll have a conversation about what we saw in everyone else's opinion. Like that's a process. That's a conversational technology. It will change your conversations. It will redesign them. It'll make them different. Maybe better, but people will only know if it works for their groups if they try it out.
Yeah, with different age ranges, you can be able to kind of integrate them into this discussion,
Yes.
whether they're, millennials or baby boomers, you know?
Yes. And that's actually one of the things that's great about this digital moment is it really is equalizing. If you take access to technology as at least a given, which it is not, right? At the very least, it makes it potentially more graphically and geographically inclusive to be able to have remote dialogues. We used to just ship people around on planes. A lot of the conferences that I'm speaking at, anybody can come to them now, right? It used to be a lot harder to have access to these experiences. They're not exactly the same, but we are flattening access, which I think is worthwhile.
Well, who knows? I might crash the next one. So,
Yeah, totally. You're more than welcome. Absolutely.
Well, and how about, because I know I'm keeping you, but gosh, I got a
Not
few
at
more
all.
questions, like how about the conversations that people tend to have in their head and sometimes they get stuck in their head with those,
Oh,
how does that
man.
go? Because that happens a
Yeah,
lot.
it does. I'm glad it's not just me. I think, again, it's not generally regarded as polite to have voices in your head, but we all do have parts of us. Look, some of it is therapy is a good thing, right? I learned about inner voice work and inner family systems from my therapy work. You can do an inner inventory, right? Like you can, this sounds weird to say this, but one of the things that I learned about conversations is that conversations have a place. They have an interface where they happen. We could be having this conversation via text, right? It would be slightly harder, but everything would be more thought out and thought through. And so the interface for the conversation changes the conversation tremendously. It enables certain things. It makes other things harder. It changes the inherent speed in the dialogue. One of the examples in the book that I used was Amanda Palmer's book, The Art of Asking. Totally amazing book. She talks about having a dinner table conversation with her husband, who's Neil Gaiman, who's like the most badass author. He's amazing. And she basically said, like, hey, let's have a junior high school note passing conversation tonight. Like they got a paper and pen from the waiter and they just passed notes and they just got to like eat their food and then just like doodle. And then like while the other person was doodling, the other person would just like eat their meal and then they would like send their note over and then the other person would read the note and then they would doodle and the other person would just, so there was a lot of silence, but they were having a conversation. And so I believe that we can apply these design principles to our own internal conversations. And that's why journaling is so effective. If you're a fan of Julia Cameron's morning pages, I am. her book, The Artist's Way, really woke me up to this value of sitting down in the morning and just pulling 3 pages of gook out of your brain. That's having a conversation with yourself. It's seeing what's going on. There's another story in the book of a woman who would go for a walk with her dog and leave herself voice messages. And we're all better at solving problems for our friends than we are for ourselves, even if we've suffered with the same or struggled with the same problem ourselves. Similarly, she was able to listen to these voice messages from herself, and it's like it's a vocal journal entry. She could, just speaking it out helped. Just saying what was going on helped, to no one, literally to no one. So there was no therapist at the other end. She was literally speaking to herself. And then sometimes she would listen to it. And when she did, it gave her a different perspective on herself. And so there are so many ways to be intentional about our internal dialogue and to change the interface of the conversation and to change the turn taking. But the most powerful way we can change the conversations with ourselves is to change the power dynamics. Usually what happens, and I'm just going to speak for myself, is when I have internal criticism or internal self-aggrandizement, I don't question those voices. When I'm hard on myself, I feel the hardness. And when I think I'm the best person in the world, I'm like, yeah, I'm doing great. When you speak with a coach will say, do you have any data to sort of defend or explain or support this assertion that this idea wouldn't work? And this is what we would do as consultants too. Like, oh, so you tried this last season and you don't want to, somebody wants to try it this season. How is this season different from last season? Like, let's actually talk it out. Why shouldn't we try that again? Like, literally. And so we don't actually have an internal conversation, Marianne. We have we just tell ourselves stuff and believe it. It's kind of a one-way dialogue, right? And so actually pausing and stopping the conversation, you're like, hey, internal bully, like name it, right? Name it and give it a location. This is what inner voice work asks us to do. Who's on your inner committee, right? And say, hey, taskmaster, you seem very concerned about me getting all this stuff done. What happens if we don't do it? Nothing. Or, oh, well, I guess shame. Oh, okay. So that the worst thing would happen is shame. So then what? Well, then nothing, right? So just inquiring of those voices, like, what are you actually afraid of? Or like, well, what evidence do you have about this? Can inquire, right? In the same way that we should inquire deeply into our the political differences with our quote unquote other side, we should be as equally curious about what our voices internally are saying to ourselves and just see if they're right or wrong, or if there's evidence. It will calm them down. They've probably never been heard before. We all have that person who just in our lives who just clearly needs to be listened to. And when they are listened to, they just relax. And so I think listening to the voices in our heads might actually help them relax a little bit and feel heard rather than just fighting them, which is what I generally do. You know, I just have a battle with my internal critic instead of just being like, well, what's going on, internal critic? What do you need, man? What's going on? Do you need a hug? Do you need some, some time? Whatever it is, we can give it to him if we ask. But generally, I don't think we ask. We just I just grind it out. I'll use I statements.
I used to talk to my dog. So, take him for walks, and Maxwell always looked a little perplexed when we'd have these conversations.
Right. He's like, that's not so hard. There are easy solutions for that, Marianne. I can help you with that.
Yeah. Where's the ball?
Right. And that's so useful to have that conversation with him, right? It helped you relax, and it helped you see, I'm guessing, that there were other things to think about in life. right?
Oh yeah,
Play.
it really puts things in perspective, because when you say it, it's like, really 100 years from now, who's going to care about this? So I mean, you show
Yeah.
up, you do the best you can,
Yes.
and really just be as authentic and kind as possible. And I think that really goes a long way.
Yes.
Being able to be in a conversation where you're really engaged and not just kind of like a runaway train, but you're there and you're actually engaging with other people. It's
Yeah.
all part of why we're here. I mean, I think conversation is the root of everything.
I agree with you. It's how our lives are literally made up of conversations. And our lives are defined by the ones we'll have and the ones we won't, and the ones we refuse to have. Right. So I think it's important to take an inventory and to look at what's up with all of them.
That is so true. I mean, that is so true. I mean, how many times does somebody, it's like, would you rather be right or would you rather have peace?
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I wonder, right? I think that's an important question. That's a great internal question to ask. It's hard to ask somebody else that question. And so trying to actually find out what somebody's real goals are. They may just really want to be right, but there's something else that they really want. There's something underneath that desire for being right. And it's worth finding out what it is if you want to have peace with them, because they may not know what it is that they want.
well, you know what? It makes, picking up your book, Good Talk, multiple copies and just shipping them off to your friends.
That would be great. Happy to
Yeah.
help with that.
Yeah, before any kind of family get together, make sure you got a copy for everybody and you ship it to them in advance.
I never thought bulk sales would be coming from family groups. All right, everybody,
Hey,
before Christmas.
before Christmas, make sure you got a month, read it up.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Well, gosh, Daniel, what final thoughts do you want to leave our listeners with today?
Oh, wow, that's a challenging one. I mean, we've talked about a lot. I do believe that conversations are the material of our lives. And so I just ask people to be reflective about them and to be intentional about them, which is a choice, right? So just take that choice to ask themselves, what can I change so that I can get more of what I want, what I really want in my life? It's a small question, but I think it's worth asking.
I think that's a very profound question. Well, Daniel, where can our listeners connect with you and learn about your work and the show that you do and your book and be part of your community?
Oh, well, the internet. It's where so many great things are. Have you heard of it? It's great. I'm pretty Googleable. So my name is Daniel Stillman. You can find me at daniel-stillman.com. But really everything I do professionally is at the Conversation Factory. That's where my podcast is, and where there's lots of downloads and things that people can play with there to learn more about designing conversations. They can download a couple of free chapters of the book and all that good stuff. That's all stuff that they can find at theconversationfactory.com. That's the best place.
That is the best place. You got so many great resources. Oh, and we didn't talk about, we'll talk about this real quick before you go, the Facilitator's Hat Deck. Oh. So I would love for you to share that with us, and what inspired you to create that?
Oh my God, I love that you looked at that. It came from, so I've been teaching facilitation for a while now, and I think I have a philosophy of adult learning that telling people how to do something is not just boring, but it stultifies their creativity. And so very, very early on, I remember teaching a framework to people where it was like a 2x2 or whatever, and I just saw everybody's eyes kind of droop. And so I don't know where it came from, honestly. I just said, hey, everyone, why don't you just draw what your hats are as a facilitator? What hats are hard for you to wear? Which hats you'd like to start wearing more often? Which ones you'd like to take off? And we used that as a way of getting people to collaborate and develop a shared framework of facilitation with other facilitators. And it just lit people up and was so fun to do because I love visual thinking. It's a way of transforming conversations that's so powerful. And over the years, of doing this exercise, I kind of just saved all the photographs of the conversation hats. Because there's some that would show up regularly, and there were some that were like new to me, and I would be like, oh, that's such a great hat. This person drew an energy shaper hat. It was a helmet with these two puppet hands with some like stars in the middle, and you could just sort of imagine these hands just shaping the space. I'm like, yes, the shaping space hat is so important. Of course we shape space.
Get out. I just pulled that from the deck.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I was like, I thought they were unicorn, like antlers, but I like the hands better.
That's on me for not drawing them that well.
No, they look great. But, it's great because it's funny that you actually mentioned that, because I actually have it here right next to the book. So
that's amazing. I love them. And I decided to make a deck with them kind of on a whim for a friend for a conference we were doing together. And they sold and people liked them. But somebody said, like, well, it's just the hat and then a name. Like, where's the rest of it? There's nothing on the back. Like, and I was like, I guess people want a little bit more. And so I started writing essays for each one of them. And so if people want, they can sign up for the free course about developing your facilitation style. There's some exercises to get people to be reflective about the hats that they wear as a facilitator. And then there's an essay for each one of the hats. And they are so fun to write. And people seem to be enjoying reading them. And maybe we'll turn them into a little booklet or something. But it's kind of the hidden. It's the back of the card that I didn't do at the time, because it's too long. You can't fit it all in one card. The time friend hat is like, it's a mega essay because I'm obsessed with time, as it turns out, as a facilitator. So yeah, that facilitation hats are. I'm in the middle of writing the second half of the essays. I have to like hurry to catch up with the people who are in the email course right now. This is how I create deadlines for myself.
Well, I am glad that you created this. I love it. I think it's really cool.
Much.
Yeah, it's what a great thing. And what a great way to engage people in another way too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you're right. I mean, how many meetings have I been to that, the guy starts talking in a monotone and you're just like, oh my God, I think I'm just going to, pass out right here, So.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just like, let's put on the performer hat. Like, let's put on a show for people today. Like, let's make it hot. Let's make it cool. Like, you have to do that on purpose, right? It doesn't happen by accident.
Well, Daniel, I mean, my goodness, we can talk forever. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you for all the lovely questions and the space and time to reflect on this topic. It's really important to me, but I think it's also important to the world. So I appreciate you making space for it.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you. And of course, to talk about your new book, Good Talk, How to Design Conversations That Matter. Good Talk is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And of course, you can get it on Kindle. If you'd like to connect with Daniel, you can at theconversationfactory.com for more information. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.